Hello, it looks like the stream has started. This is part of the Astrotheology discussion series. And I'll just start by saying, for those who would not have seen the intro video first, that in these discussions, I'm not endorsing or encouraging belief in any specific interpretation of astrotheology, but I do find the topic of astrotheology interesting, so I want to present and discuss various interpretations that people do have. So for today's particular discussion, I want to focus on one of the books that I have. This one is called The Celestial Code of Scripture. There's a subtitle here. The Astral Cipher Underlying the Miracle Stories of the Bible and Quran. And it is by John McHugh. This book, I believe, is from 2020. I'm just going to flip it to check. I think it's from 2021. Yeah, so this is from maybe a year ago. And I have read it. I have a time slot of maybe less than 2 hours. So I don't think, or I'm not sure that I will get through discussing the entire book. But the way this particular book is arranged, I'll say, is that about the first half, the introduction through chapter 6, is more the lead up and explaining the approach and the method. And then the second half of the book, chapters 7 through, I can just show the table of contents, that's there. So the first half of the book, like here, or the first portion, I don't know if it's really like 50%, but is like the method and approach. And then this second portion, I guess through chapter 15, 7 through 15, is more the specifics, the interpretation of specific stories, specific miracle and myth stories. And there is a short epilogue in this book that I think is only like 2 pages. It's just a brief summary, or not even a summary of the work, just more like thoughts for the future. So I may get through just talking about this portion today. I'm not sure. Okay, so let's just start. I'm going to start by saying I have some notes here. The first, there is a brief prologue, but I would say the introduction. So, okay, well, first let me just talk about the book. It's a good book. It's like well produced. It says that the list price is $35 US. Monkfish Publishing is the publisher of this particular edition that I have. So like a trade paperback style. I don't know if I paid that much for it, because I probably got it on Amazon, and sometimes you have like credits or gift cards or like whatever. But okay, so in the introduction, the author, McHugh, is talking about his own background. So let's just go. I do not know this. He's a man, John McHugh. I don't know the author. I have seen videos of his presentations to other groups, and I have read the book. He's saying, or I guess whoever wrote the blurb on the back, or the bio, he's a licensed archaeologist with a master's degree in Near Eastern and Native American archaeology. In the introduction chapter, and I'll just show fair use, I'm going to show a few excerpts and samples. Let me just go to that part. So the introduction is titled "The Mystery Emerges." So, how did the author even get into this idea of there being a code? So, as he's saying, he grew up in a Roman Catholic family. I think this was, as far as my understanding from the context of the book, is that this was in America, in the U.S. And Irish ancestry, like in American culture, to say one is Irish Catholic, that doesn't mean you're from a separate church. They're Roman Catholics, but there's a strong Catholic and Irish immigrant identity. So not everyone may know that, but if you are in the States and you're Irish and Catholic, a lot of times it'll just be like Irish Catholic. That's what people say. So that he goes over that in the book. I'm saying this because I also was raised in an Irish and Roman Catholic family. So he did relate to that. So then I guess at some time in his youth, he got interested in the stars. So that's the other part. You have a religious background to know about scripture. And then you get interested in the sciences, astronomy, something like that. At some point, the author discusses having an epiphany. I'm not going to go into specifics. I mean, that's kind of like his story, but just in general, I believe that people at times in their life, I don't know that I can say I've had this moment of but the author does describe a particular moment where it just clicked for him, like maybe that faith path wasn't for him. So he was questioning the faith that he had been raised with. And I know there are many people in the world that go through that. Whether you end up leaving that faith or not, I mean, people choose that. But a lot of people will go through a questioning phase at some point in their youth or when they're growing up. And so going through that questioning process, one looks for other answers. And I think that's kind of what the author McHugh is talking about. And so eventually he goes to schools and universities, and I think he says that at first he was focused more on Native American culture, because I guess from the context of the book, again, I'm not trying to spoil the whole book. This isn't like a book report or book review in the sense of I'm telling you should or shouldn't read it. I just am discussing, my thoughts on the content. But I don't want to spoil it in such a way that I'm detracting from people wanting to go read the book. So he was interested in first in Native American culture because he was in America, but also my understanding is that he spent some time in the more western states. There's some mentions of place names in that, those first chapters. And then at some point, my understanding is that after he began his schooling, he I don't know if transferred is the correct term, but in addition to the Native American studies, went to study Near Eastern culture. And I believe this involved studying multiple languages. Now, I think the author says himself he has kind of a reading knowledge or a working knowledge. He doesn't claim, he's the 100% fluent master in all ancient languages. But the author is stating that he has studied these languages, and that's why he can present certain interpretations. I do not know Sumerian or Akkadian or Hebrew. I mean, I know only a few words, the way that people just know loan words and some suffixes and prefixes and stuff of Greek and Latin, but I also don't read Greek or Latin. So this is the kind of book where you kind of have to trust that the scholar is doing that work for you. That's just the type of book this is, if you yourself don't have that academic background to check the translations. Another thing that, and I don't know if there's like any specific picture that went, yeah, there's this section on mental maps. And the author explains this by talking about how at one time in his life, he was working with children, professionally, in some capacity, working with children who had, I believe, I don't recall the terms that he uses, but that have some kind of emotional distress, or also separately, children have learning difficulties, or so. This term of mental maps, he's saying, is that when you want to interact with a person that has a whole different way of thinking, you first need to establish how their thinking works so that you can appropriately help them and communicate with them. But this experience, he's saying, led him to understand that, and then also when he, actually studied ancient cultures, led him to understand the same thing applies when you study a culture. You have, the person, not any you, but the general you, a person has to, or at least, I don't know if has to, but it helps if you understand how those people thought. So they would have a mental map, and that is going to come back later in another chapter. So the introduction is just that. It's mostly talking about the mental maps, the author's background. Chapter 1 is Heaven in the Sky, or Heaven is the Sky. I'll just flip through a little bit. Heaven is the Sky. And this chapter mostly gets into themes from some ancient myths, and how there's ways that we can identify that part of this mental map of ancient people. And at this point, I believe McHugh would be talking about Sumerian and the later related Akkadian culture. And those being the cultures that left for us the Sumerian writing system that was cuneiform, which the separate Akkadian language also used as their writing system. And this is very important to his premise of this work, that I think there's a picture of some of it. Right, so Sumerian has these little wedge shapes that are arranged in different directions and arrangements, and that's where they get the various logograms that have meaning. And then in Akkadian, they would also write in this, but their spoken language when they were reading it was different. It was Akkadian, not Sumerian. And this, I think I'm getting ahead of myself, but it is first important for understanding the whole premise is that, yes, there's the language portion of Sumerian and Akkadian having this play of different spoken words, but the same symbol. But also that the mental map of the people of that period was that the concept of the heavens or the sky, it wasn't as I was saying, the author was raised Roman Catholic. People tend to think of heaven as an otherworldly plane, an otherworldly dimension or spiritual realm, not just it's in the sky. Although, I mean, in like cartoons and stuff, you'll see, people sitting on the cloud. We don't, like, today literally think that there's like angels sitting on the cloud. It took on more like ethereal sense. But in ancient times, he's saying the mental map of those people was that they were more literally thinking what you see in the sky. For example, the sun, clouds, the moon, stars. That is heaven. That is the realm of the gods. And if you see something there, this is the belief of the ancients, that meant like the gods were leaving that for you to see. So he discusses a few of the specific myths from that time period, flood stories, semi-related stories with like sea monsters or sea serpents, people walking on the sea, things like that, because there's a kind of a crossover that happens here where the sky and heaven are the same thing, but they are also associated with water. So I feel like maybe it could help if I'm like drawing this or showing it or something, but so it's like sky, heaven, sea of stars. It's a sea. Okay? So that realm that the ancients would look up to the sky, and they would have an understanding like, oh, rain comes from there, but they didn't have, our understanding of the water cycle. They would just think that like there must be water up there that can get released and fall down to us. So it is a watery realm that we're looking at. And I think this is something that in other cultures also applies, at least to some extent, when you get to talking about things like there being like a great whirlpool in the sea somewhere. It doesn't necessarily mean the oceans of the world have this like great hollow whirlpool, although there are whirlpool effects at places in the world, but there being this great whirlpool in the ocean could just be polar stars. If you think about the way that polar stars spin around. I'll show here, like this rivet is marking north on this particular star map. These stars are all spinning around that point, like, and you probably have seen there's like those time-lapse photos of it. It looks like they're whirling around a point in the sky. Okay, so the third chapter was, chapter 2, which is the third, concluding the intro. Chapter 2 was about Mesopotamian scriptures in the Greek constellations. So at that point, we're getting to later cultures, right? Because in so-called like Western culture, it's like General West, but we got our culture generally from Greek and Latin sources, but then the Greeks got theirs from Babylon, That's what is going to be talked about. But then Babylon is the successor of Sumer and Akkad. So it goes Sumer and Akkad, Babylon, Greek, Latin kind of later got drawn into that, and then the general, like, quote, West of today. So the constellations that we know are basically the same, mostly. I mean, there's been modifications, and medieval and later people introduce some new constellations, but generally, especially the Zodiac constellations, we still have the ones that the Greeks had. But what this chapter, Mesopotamian scriptures in the Greek constellations, is kind of talking about is, why do they have the same themes? So here I think I can maybe show a few pictures from that chapter. Chapter 2. Okay, so these are illustrations mostly by Elizabeth Hardy. So here's one where they're showing, this is from the Epic of Gilgamesh, but if you see the stars, that's basically our constellation Taurus. And there's in this chapter is going to explain how this represents not a star specifically, but the planet Venus as it would be on the ecliptic path. So, for example, on this okay, I'll hold it. I'm getting a reflection. Oh yeah, I actually do have Taurus on this part right here. Yeah, I have a lamp. I'm losing the window light, so I have a lamp on, and I'm getting sometimes reflection on this plastic map, or the plastic cover of the map. What was I saying? Oh yeah. So this is a map from recent times. So in history, it would be slightly different, just because of, we'll talk about that later, I guess. But this shaded gray area is the ecliptic. And that's the path that you'll see the sun and moon and the planets will follow that general band. And the constellations that are along that path are what we know as the Zodiac constellations. So if you think of, and I dropped the page that it was open to. Right, so if you think about that, then it makes sense that anything that's a zodiac constellation, it can have an interaction with a figure that is represented by a planet. So if the constellation represents something, and there's a myth about that, okay, so if this is the example, if the constellation represents a bull, and there's a myth about a bull interacting with some deity, and that deity is then associated with the planet, then it's like the myth story is basically from the skies. So, stories about a bull, that's something that different myths have in common. There's, like, in the Gilgamesh story, Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu, or Enkidu, they fight the so-called Bull of Heaven. But in, like, the Mithras story, which is from later cultures, I believe Greek had it, and then eventually went to Rome, they also had bull-slaying myths. There being... Is there another one? I'm just flipping through quickly to see. Someone, oh, that's Aquarius. Yeah. Oh, okay. I see. The connection here was the different myths of someone being carried away by an eagle. Yeah. Characters like Ganymede or Etana are from different cultures. but both were carried away by an eagle. Also, I think in this chapter they introduced the idea of the Pegasus field, which I believe if we get to chapter 7 is important one to know. So let's just like flip through a couple of these. Okay, so here's Aquila. And that I have it kind of stick figure ways on the flashcard, but this would be like the eagle that is carrying away a figure. Sometimes that figure is associated with Aquarius, which is a nearby constellation, so you would see, them together. Are they on? I probably can flip to them on here. Yeah. Hold on while I turn this. Yeah, they're not, because of Aquarius is like pretty large. I mean, along the ecliptic, it's pretty wide in this version, or on this, what's the projection, the map projection. Okay, so Aquila is here. I'm probably not able to show this very clearly. Aquila is here, but the edge of Aquarius is like just diagonally down from it. It's like right here. I mean, it also extends to over here, but it's not far. And there are other stars and figures here, so it could sometimes be imagined that the eagle is grasping one of these other figures. Example, I don't know if you can see that. Delphinus, which is the dolphin, is a small figure near the eagle. Okay, so that basically that chapter of I'm just getting my cards out of alphabetical order. Oh no. Okay, well, they're fine. So that chapter about the Mesopotamian scriptures is basically just saying, look at how there's patterns that show up in both of these cultures. Are they just inheriting the myth, or is there something more to it, and they're both, I guess putting stock in it because of their shared astronomy, that they're watching the same stars, or is there maybe even, and I think this leads to, I'm sorry, I'm getting camera shake. This leads to, but did scholars from one group actually go and study with another? And I believe that is what comes up in a later chapter. Yeah, so the third chapter, or I'm sorry, chapter number 3 is called What the Magi Knew. What the Magi knew. And this kind of gets into like the Magi being from this kind of like Babylonian culture that is the successor of Sumer and Akkad. So by the time that it's Babylonian culture, I'm trying to remember what the author says. I don't know if they're still speaking Akkadian or another language, but definitely the scholars still were using the older languages, including the cuneiform of Samaria, for different, like what they'll learn. It could be for religious or scientific, because I'm understanding like the mental map of the time. I don't know that there was a very big difference yet between religion and science. I think it was all just like things that learned people do. So that's where mental maps comes back, because the mental map of the ancient people would be heaven is the sky. Anything that we see in the skies, it comes from the gods. They already had their own writing systems, such as cuneiform. And so they imagined that things could be written in the sky. Like once a culture has their own version of writing, then they're prepared to see that like the deities have written something for them. So like if you hadn't ever in a culture, if it was an oral culture, you would be thinking differently, right? I mean, that's the expectation, that if a culture really was oral and didn't have their own writing, they wouldn't be thinking that like, oh, God wrote some down for them. Okay, so this gets into the puns, right? So this chapter about the Magi, it kind of, I don't want to say establishes, because it might have come up in an earlier chapter, but introduces more, or more asserts, I guess, the idea that puns, although like today, and I think the author puts it this way in the book, like today the people just think it's like funny for gags, but to ancients with their own mental map, and they're talking about these specific like Mesopotamian and Mediterranean cultures in the time that the author is speaking about. To them, wordplay, these kind of like, not figurative language, because it's more specific than that, but puns, I guess like homophones, general, and then like, what's the one for, okay, so like if things look alike or if they sound alike. It was like, I don't want to say hilarious to them, because it wasn't. I mean, it could be hilarious today, but it was like really special to them to like, whoa, the gods hid this for us. This meaning was here the whole time, and I just realized it, you guys. That's not how McHugh puts it in the book, but I'm kind of just imagining that is what he's trying to impress upon us, the reaction of discovering like, this looks like that other thing, and the gods, they're telling us something. It was just so important to their faith that the gods could put things in the sky. So that kind of leads to the next chapter, and we'll just take a quick look at that. So the chapter 4 is called Rediscovering the Celestial Code. Oh, I'll get to the beginning. Ooh, this is a longer chapter. Chapter 4, Rediscovering the Celestial Code. And in this chapter, there are some specific myths and constellations that are gone over. And I think this chapter is mostly for the reader going over, this is the code. Like, now we've talked about heaven is the sky. Different cultures have these similar patterns in their myths, and that there are these schools of learned people that know Sumerian and Akkadian and other later languages like Greek, also, or that just really love puns. And when they find puns, and similar types of, not only just puns, but similar types of wordplay, and almost like, I guess, like visual, like, I'm trying to think if there's a name for when two things look alike, Like a homophone is when they have the same sound. And homonym, I think, is when they have the same meaning? No. Oh my goodness. I'm sorry. Just like, I mean, okay. I have like some notes of what to talk about, but this is not rehearsed. I'm just like discussing it. And sometimes I'm gonna just like not think of the best way to say it at first. It's not practiced. But I guess what I'm saying is like, so this chapter is kind of summing up the previous 3 chapters in a sense. What are we talking about there being a code? So I might, let me see if I'm pronouncing this. McHugh uses a specific word, Lumashi constellation writing. So part of the whole premise or theory of this work is that they believed that the gods were writing this when they saw like the stars and the constellations, and maybe a constellation looks like cuneiform, or cuneiform looks like a constellation, or there's a pun in the name of something that sounds like something from another language, then it's like a cross-culture or cross-lingual pun. And the more of that stuff that they found, the more it seemed sacred. Like in their mental map, their way of thinking, it was like, this is religion. This is like the gods if we find these patterns. We found the thing that nobody else realized, and they just get like so excited about it. So that's what it's talking about in this chapter. Like, what is the code? And like here, I'll just show, this is another of the illustrations by Elizabeth Hardy. So it'll show like a logogram, and then it will say like the reading or the name of, because both are covered in. And I personally don't know enough about the Sumerian to always like, I mean, yes, I read it, and McHugh is spelling it out. I'm just saying it could be that I'm just not always, this is my bad that I'm not explaining it as definitely, but it'll be like the logogram, then it'll be like Sumerian, and that will be like the reading of or the name of the logogram, and then it'll have a translation. So this symbol was the hired worker, but also it can be ram. And so he's saying here like the hired worker becomes the ram. And if you probably can already guess, and I've talked about this one before. This one here it is. So here's Aries as the ram, the way I have it drawn. And you can see there's the triangle. But here's the same stars, and that's the plow, and this is the hired worker. I don't actually know, in terms of these stars, how they saw the worker. In the illustrations in this particular work, in McHugh's work with Elizabeth Hardy's illustrations, it looks like Hamal, the star named Hamal, is the knee. That's what it looks like to me. That, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not in frame. That this star Hamal is the knee, meaning the feet is down here, and this must be the head up in this region. And then this hired worker is operating the plow, which is over here. But again, they're the same stars. In the case of the Aries card, I have filled in some of the dimmer stars that also appear in that area of the sky that we today designate as Aries. But the main stars are like Hamal is that star. And I think this one's called Messertim or Messerteam. Yeah, so those are the same two stars there. And the triangle. So anyway, that's what I'm saying is this code that in the later chapters will be broken down like story by story. In these chapters, the author John McHugh is just presenting how this code works out and how he's going to present it. He's going to show us logograms. He's going to show various translated phrases and words. There's going to be the illustrations of how those stars would have the imagined picture or character around them. So that's pretty much the kind of stuff that is found in chapter 4. It goes over Aries, the Great Square of Pegasus, Taurus, especially Pleiades being the shoulder of a bull figure, and Argo constellation. Now, where I live in the north, we can't really see Argo, not in this time period, but things, movements of the earth being as they are, I believe in antiquity, more of Argo was visible from the northern hemisphere. So today, if you're in the southern hemisphere, I think you can see much more of Argo. And I think, I think today, only this bit here is in the north, and a lot of this would be in the south. So viewed from the north looking south, it kind of is like this in the sky, I think, or at least today it is. So there's some of the stories in the book Celestial Code of Scripture will also use Argo as one of the constellations that they talk about. The author. Okay, so the next chapter was, chapter 5 was Greek Magi learn to read the heavenly writing. So this specifically is jumping ahead. So, we start out first with the author's, basically modern day background. Then go back to as far back as, the Sumerian culture. How their myths were transmitted up to Babylonian times. And then in chapter 5, it's how specifically, if this theory or this premise of the Lumashi constellation writing is correct, and it's based on knowing Sumerian logograms, and it's not just the stories are passed from culture to culture, then how would the Greek people who were writing their myths, who we wouldn't assume to read cuneiform because they, in that later time, had the Greek alphabet derived from Phoenician by then, right? Why would they be able to read the same type of, why wouldn't they have different puns? Well, in some cases they did. How they were talking about Aries being the hired worker or the ram. In the Greek myths, it is a ram. And in the older, Babylonian that are being derived from Sumer and Akkad, those myths, it was a person. It was a human hired worker figure. So sometimes the meanings do change. And there can be puns to explain that. Or it can just be because different puns work out more or less. For example, if you have a word that sounds like another word, but, like if you have a Akkadian word or a Sumerian logogram, but it sounds like something else from like Hebrew, for example. Well, the person who speaks Hebrew is going to understand that better than, someone who doesn't speak Hebrew. It won't be special meaning to them. So I think the same is for Greek. The people that were speaking Greek would recognize when something has a pun or wordplay that works in Greek, but they could, and I think this is what McHugh is suggesting, is that in this time period, I think we're now, not now today, but now in the book in chapter 5, are talking about a time period that was like mid of the first millennium BC. So maybe the 500s BC or earlier, or up to that time, when there was what they call like hostage taking. And I think in the book there's mention of like, oh, and this happens in the Bible, but I think there probably are secular sources that also cover this phenomenon of, for example, the name Homer for the school, or theoretically an individual, or his school of poetry, the Homeric epics and such. The word Homer means hostage. Is that possibly telling us that there were learned people who were in an other country? They were the foreigners present in that other country, and so they did learn their types of writing. So just as today there's classicists and other types of scholars, some archaeologists, for example, who can recognize these puns again today because they've learned the ancient languages. Well, in ancient times, people could be, multilingual, polyglot, whatever the term is, and they could have discovered these puns for maybe it was the first time. So I think that's mostly what's covered in chapter 5. I think there's like a little bit about like how like slavery and piracy, but it's not necessary to understand the rest of the book. It just goes into like in ancient times how people could end up, working in other countries. Okay, so then chapter 6 is called The Modern Quest for Pan-Babylonian Wisdom Dies. Oh, I'm in the wrong part of the book. Okay, that's chapter 5. Where's my chapter 6? It's a shorter chapter. I found it. Oh, no, I didn't. It's right here somewhere. That's the end of it. That's 5. Wait, not 7. This is so weird. Oh, okay, it is. It's just these last couple pages. Sorry, that was weird. The Modern Quest for Pan-Babylonian Wisdom Dies. So the last chapter I said we kind of like jumped ahead as far as like maybe the 500s BC, possibly getting into later antiquity, but more in the time when those myth stories would have been written. The versions that we have today probably would have been composed in or before that time. But then going to chapter 6, which is a like fairly short chapter, skips ahead to the 20th century, looking back. So now we're back in the full circle. We went to the 20th century again, and I mean, people know 20th century history. There was like a whole bunch of a war in the middle of the century. And there's a lot of like how things were going before the war and how things were going after is like almost like very different cultures, whatever part of the world you're in. So at some time, I think the author was saying the earlier part of the 20th century, there were people that were trying to understand the origins of culture, and they didn't yet have the same archaeological discoveries that we do have today. And in some ways, archaeology itself was like fairly young. I mean, there was just a bunch of people taking artifacts and for their own use, and there was a lot of stuff. And now then you hear stories today about how stuff has to get repatriated. But anyway, that's not the point of this. This is just talking about how in the earlier 20th century there was all this interest in like discovering this like all-encompassing culture that had existed in the past. And then you get like the wars, or the war mostly in the middle, World War II, in the middle of the century. And then like afterward, it's like, yeah, people don't want to like look as much at, they don't want to look as much at like, oh, there was some kind of like ancient all-encompassing culture that influenced us all. Like it wasn't like, I mean, I think I'm possibly interpreting this like a little differently than the author intended, but that's what it seems to me. It was like there really is that cultural shift with like the war in the 20th century, where it's like views of like culture and the past and like sensitivity to people using or appropriating more ancient culture for their own current political uses. I think people just got a lot more sensitive to that. Plus, at the same time, people moved away from religion in the sense that many things that we are in the West, quote, became more secular. And whereas you'll say in the 19th century, there was still people trying to prove the biblical flood. I mean, there's some people that still do that today. But I mean, even people that were considered like, the respectable scholars, if it was like the 19th century, they were like, we're out here looking for the ark, or we're looking for the biblical flood. And you get to like later in the 20th century and they're like, those books are just their stories. It's literature, they're stories. So it's understandable that we could have moved so far away that we had to, as like John McHugh is saying, have our own kind of epiphany or discovery moment of like, oh, now maybe it's okay to go back and look at all this ancient stuff and put it together in a different way and understand, like, in their time period, that these stories that we were taking so literally, like whether it's like a flood or bull slaying, and we see them across so many cultures, it's because they were looking at these messages in the stars. And that's like mostly that's pretty much brings us to like the first half of the book. It like starts, the childhood of the author McHugh and that would have probably, I'm guessing, yeah, it would have been in the 20th century. And then it goes back in time to like Sumeria, jumps forward in steps, then goes back to the 20th century again. And now, this book is published in the year 2021, and I'm here in the 21st century in 2022 and, discussing the book. So I think I'm going to save talking about any of the specific interpretations for another stream and video. And because, well, one, I've used up about an hour of the time that I had. But I think I just want to read through the second half of the book again before I talk about it. And I'm not quite done with that. Also, I want to work on some of the visual aids because I know it's not super interesting to watch when it's just like, oh, here's the picture of the book, and like occasionally, I mean, I worked on my flashcards. There was another stream about that, so I did end up finishing them. So I redid up through Virgo. They're alphabetized right now. So I did improve those. And I mentioned this in the last stream, I still have a couple of other books on order that should arrive like early next week. And those could help with just like quickly flipping through to show, just not, spoiling the whole books, but to have something else to just quickly show as a comparison. Because when we get into the other chapters, and I'll just show as like, kind of as a preview from chapter 7, where I have this mark, we're going to get into the specific stories, and you'll see that there's like a progression. This is again, Elizabeth Hardy. It'll show like, okay, here's how they would have seen the constellations, but then there'll be a progression of the author saying, now remember this meaning of this logogram, but then if you add this type of meaning, it becomes another word, and it kind of builds. So like each chapter will have these, and I'm not going to show everything, like, because like I said before, I'm not trying to detract or like spoil someone from reading the book. I'm just, like showing some excerpts so you can understand the type of book it is. But it will build. So each specific chapter will cover maybe like, I don't know, like a star group or one or two different myths. And it will build on the wordplay and the visual similarities until it gets like more and more in depth. And then basically it will end up like, when you put all those words together, it's almost literally telling you the words from Scripture. That's kind of the premise here. That we're going to see so much wordplay in the Magi constellation writing that by the time you get to the end of a section, it will literally be the Scripture. So whether you choose to believe in this interpretation or not, and I will in the next stream show more of the details. I mean that's up to the reader of the book or the viewer, but I think it's just interesting to talk about the interpretations and the possibilities, because I know from reading other books on the topic about astrotheology that the interpretations don't even agree. Like one person will say like, maybe they'll say like, oh, Aquarius is John the Baptist, but then somebody else will be like, well, we think Aquarius is Peter, or Aquarius is Noah. And it's like, it maybe could be all of those figures, because as some of the authors in this genre topic will indicate, one constellation could, in a manner of speaking, play the part of many myth figures. But at the same time, we can just disagree. Like, where in the sky is Eve, for example? In this book, John McHugh, in a later chapter, is going to say where he thinks Eve comes from in terms of the Magi constellation writing. But I know the other authors will point to a different constellation, and they will say, like, in their interpretation, that other constellation is Eve. So I'm not coming down and saying, like, there's one that's more right or wrong. I just think it's so interesting that we get these different interpretations, and yet they are agreeing that there's some kind of pattern there. The specifics can differ. The specifics of how those patterns were created and understood, or which correspondences specifically are included, can differ. But there's a number of people that are agreeing that there is a pattern in use. And I just think it's kind of like how I was saying before, where in the mind map of the mental map of the ancients, that they would be like, whoa, we just discovered this thing that nobody knew. That's a phenomenon that happens today, and a lot of times on the internet when people get into, like, especially into something that's more fringe, or like not conspiracy theory, but something that's just like a bit more non-academic and fringe. They tend to get this, like, oh, we discovered the thing. This is the thing that nobody else is acknowledging. And I mean, I've done this too. And we can just get so excited about it. It could end up later to be I would say real, because it's a conceptual thing. It's not, we can't, like, I mean, it's not like in that sense of, like, tangible and stuff. But anyway, how things can be real or reality or not is probably a separate discussion. But I just want to say thanks if you watch. And I do plan on continuing this stream with the later chapters of the book. I don't know if that will all be in one stream, or I'll split it with the different star groupings and myths, and do a couple, or maybe like do one in depth and then like skip through the others in a little bit more brief style. Because again, I want to be able to discuss the works, but at the same time not spoil them too much. So I'm going to have to find the balance, because, this series is new for me. And obviously I'm kind of new to live streaming and making videos to post online. So I do thank you if you watch, and I hope to continue this. Thanks.